Thank you. So let me first begin with an announcement which I hope you will view as offering you good news. And that is that you're going to get your final exams day after tomorrow on Thursday. They'll be emailed to you sometime before 6 p.m. The syllabus mentions that the due date is Tuesday, but in fact the due date will be Friday. So you have 8 days to write the exam. And if you happen to have other final exams which are before that, then obviously that gives you, I think, ample time. I think 8 days is in fact exceedingly generous. So, that gives you an opportunity, all of you, to write a good exam, I hope. Let me mention once again for the final time the format so that you can think about it once again, but the format is exactly as it's stipulated on the syllabus, namely you get 6 questions divided into 3 groups of 2 questions each. Group 1 you answer both questions, Group 2 you get 2 questions, you answer 1, Group 3 you get 2 questions, you answer 1. So you answer 4 out of 6 questions. The exam will be turned in by email, so you do not have to come into campus to turn in the exam. You're going to send it to me as a Word attachment, and the directions are given very clearly on the exam. There are 2 email addresses to which you're going to send the exam, but all of that will be mentioned on the instructions accompanying the questions, and you're responsible for everything in this course from day 1 until my last lecture on Thursday. Okay? Any questions at all? You don't need to ask me questions about format, what format you should use, whether it's, whether you should have footnotes or not. I've spoken about that, and again, all of that is mentioned explicitly in the instructions accompanying the exam. Yes, Dominic.
When you get the emails, are you going to send like a little email?
No. The instructions say that very clearly. You just send it to two email addresses. Assume that I've received the exam, because you know what happens if you send it to an incorrect address, it will bounce back. Okay? So, and do not send me an email asking me to acknowledge receipt of the exam. Right? If you've sent the exam to 2 email addresses stipulated on the exam, just assume that I've received the exam. Okay? Any further questions, mechanical questions of that kind? Yes. It's going to be due in my inbox at 6 p.m. on Friday, December 19th. All right, so you have a full 8 days to write the exam. Anything else that anybody would like to ask related to? Yeah.
You could turn it in or submit it before.
Of course. Needless to say, yeah. If you get it done beforehand and you just want to get rid of that obligation, not have it weighing on you, by all means, email it earlier. Yeah. All right? Okay, so my lecture today is a continuation of what I'd been speaking to you about in the previous class, and I'd been talking to you about popular Hindi cinema, popular culture as a whole, and I had actually put forward a number of questions, such as why do the cops arrive always late in the Hindi film? What is the nature of the song? That all the actors and actresses were singing. They're not actually singing. There's somebody called the playback singer. So that's the person who's actually singing. And there is a woman by the name of Lata Mangeshkar. She holds the world record for the number of songs that she has recorded. It's something in the neighborhood of I think, about 100,000 or something like that. And her sister, Asha Bhonsle, some people don't know that they're related, but they're sisters. Between the 2 of them, they have dominated the Hindi film industry. They're not so dominant now because they've obviously aged, but for 3, 4, 5 decades, if you heard a female voice, it was either Lata or Asha. A few others as well, but these 2 together. So there you've got the playback singer. I put forward a number of interesting questions of that sort. As I said, we can easily multiply the list of questions. And the last question I'd posed for you, apropos of this film, I'm going to see some clips. If I don't show the clips to you now, I never will, because once I start lecturing, I can just keep on going on. I think we will begin with a clip. But the question I'd posed for you before was, how does one interpret the story of the 2 brothers? For those of you familiar with other kinds of literature, you might think about Abel and Cain, any number of variations of the 2 brothers, the good brother, the bad brother. And the last comment I think offered to you was that we need to understand why, for example, in Hollywood, You get the schizophrenic kind of character, which you never really get, or the character with a bipolar kind of personality, which you never really get in the Hindi film. Very, very rarely, and it's only very recently that you get it. But on the other hand, you do get two brothers, you get three brothers, two sisters. And one of the things I'd suggested was that the idea of the good and the bad that is within each person is now projected externally. That is, that you cast it as two separate characters. And that's typically the way in which the Hindi film works. One of the other interesting things about the Hindi film is, again, as an illustration, that very rarely do you find a family that is whole, right? Where you have, 10 members of the family, and each of them is there, and each of them has an arm and a limb and an eye and an ear. Something's always missing, which is very interesting because, of course, the notion of the family has been all important in every civilization, perhaps, but certainly the Hindi film has gravitated around the family to an extraordinary degree. And yet the family is never whole. So if you've seen this film, there's the absent father, for example, right? I mean, the father just disappears after the first 10, 15 minutes, and there are 2-3 spots in the film where he's found and he doesn't say a word because he's found sitting on a railway coach or something like that, but he's missing. It's the absent father. Right? And this absent father here should not be interpreted the way in which white liberals will very often interpret the black family today and say, the real problem with the black family is the absent male figure, right? The absent father. No, this is not simply that syndrome that we're talking about. What we're talking about is incomplete families. And one of the reasons why they're incomplete, I want to suggest to you, is because many of the films of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, they were all living out the trauma of the partition of India of 1947. Very few films were ever made on the partition. The most traumatic incident in 20th century Indian history, which split a civilization, split a country, created a new country, created a religious divide. And you would have thought there would be thousands of films and books investigating this phenomenon. Well, it was rarely investigated, the whole phenomenon of the partition. And yet, what I am suggesting to you is that many of these films were in fact acts of displacement. That is, that you have to now have a strategy for reading the film. So this film, yes, you can read it simply as a narrative about what happens in a family. You can read it as a narrative of the conflict between two brothers, the fight between the good and the evil. You can read it as a narrative of what happens when you get to the big city, right? It's a big city film. Remember, it begins in a small place and then it transitions to something else. One of the things that I've mentioned to you in this class is the phenomenon of the massive migration to cities in the post-independent period. I gave the illustration of Delhi, which grew from a population of less than 500,000 in 1947 before partition to a city which now has 21 million people. And that's true of many of the great urban centers in India. Right? So this film can be read in all of these ways. But I'm suggesting that when you see the incomplete family, one possible hypothesis that you need to think about is that many of these films were working out the trauma of the partition as well. Right? People who get displaced, and of course the brothers, two brothers. It's the split self. The self that was whole, and now it becomes India and it becomes Pakistan. And when you say that, you don't want to mechanically map on. You don't say Vijay stands for India and Ravi stands for Pakistan or vice versa. No, you don't want to do it in mechanical fashion. It's not like there's a template there. But I'm just saying that it's going to require some amount of creative work to interpret these films. Many people watching the films thinking, well, there's really nothing to interpret. I mean, it's a very simple story, simple dialogue. This one is a little brainier than many of the others. I mean, they're completely brainless in the films, for sure. Right? But even those films, in fact, require a great deal of interpretive work because the Hindi filmmaker draws upon an enormous reservoir of material which is not available to anyone else in the world. And what is that enormous reservoir of material that he or she draws upon? They draw upon the entire mythic material of Indian civilization, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Puranas. Right? So the Mahabharata is this great epic the fight between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, massive, Ramayana. And the Hindi filmmaker Manmohan Desai, he made what are called blockbuster films. So one of the films he made was Amar Akbar Anthony, which I had mentioned before. You know, 3 brothers, 1 Christian, 1 Hindu, 1 Muslim. So here you had a narrative about the unity of India. It's also the lost and found story. Okay, so the 3 brothers, you know, they don't know they're brothers. They get separated, you know, in childhood. There's a trauma, and then they get reunited at the end. All right? And you know, and if you're saying, oh, it's not a realistic, no, the films are never realistic. That's not the material they draw upon. They draw upon this huge mythic material, and this is the material. So Manmohan Desai, this filmmaker who made this film, he was asked, what are all your films about? And he gave this astonishing reply. And he said, all my films are about the Mahabharata. And if you see the film, unless you know the mythic material, unless you know the narratives of the Mahabharata, the hundreds and thousands of stories which are enfolded within the Mahabharata, Mahabharata is a massive epic, right? Stereotypically, it's always described as a work that is 7 times the size of the Iliad and the Odyssey put together. That's how big it is. There are thousands of stories in it. And of course, very few people know all the stories, but the filmmaker is relying upon the major elements of the narrative, which are widely available to everybody in India, regardless of whether you know how to read or not. You can be completely illiterate, and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are like mother's milk to these Indians. They just grow up with these stories. Right? So the filmmaker, I'm saying, has this huge reservoir of epic material. Now, Deewaar, before I show you the clip, let's briefly, the context. So film is made in 1975. The major actor, Amitabh Bachchan, who plays Vijay, the smuggler, the Don, the mafia Don. Amitabh Bachchan basically becomes a huge star in the early 1970s. There's a film he makes called Zanjeer, Chains, and then there's Deewaar, The Wall, and in the same year of 1975, there's another film called Sholay, which is Embers, okay? Very often these films are described as representing that phase of his life which is called the angry young man. So this film is supposed to be the quintessential representation of the angry young man. Well, what is he angry about? That's the first thing. If there is something called the angry young man, and one of the things that he's angry about is about, of course, the crises of life that afflict those like him who have moved into the city. And how do you cope with life? What are the hazards that you have to think about? Right? What are the prospects for employment? There's this wonderful film, an art film as it's called. This is a mainstream commercial cinema. There's this art film made by Satyajit Ray, India's most well-known director among film scholars and students the world over. Right? And so in one of these films, there's this fantastic scene where this young man, you know, the film is set in Calcutta in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and he goes for a job interview, right? He's got his certificates, you know, he's got a bachelor's degree in history or physics or whatever it is, and these 3 men seated behind the desk they ask him some questions at this job interview, right? One of the questions they ask him is, what is the weight of the moon? Now, how on earth would anybody know what the weight of the moon is unless you happen to be a physicist, for example, or you've just crammed all the facts of this kind that you think you might be asked about? And what the film is, of course, doing there when this candidate gets asked this absolutely absurd question, what is the weight of the moon? Right? What he's showing is that, you know, this situation of despair, this young man, he's gone for 100 interviews and he doesn't get a single job. Now, what this film, Deewaar, is set in is 1975. What was happening around that period of time? So you're talking about an economy that is in a state of considerable disrepair. In 1975, just around the time that this film was going to be screened, India went through its first major crisis in democracy because Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, imposed an internal emergency. I've talked about that in the book, very briefly. She imposed an internal emergency. The grounds for imposing that emergency was that India was threatened by external enemies, i.e. Pakistan, and internal enemies, internal elements of dissent. And this would mean labor unions, for example. So this film, again, has an interesting intervention, the clip that we're going to start off with. Because the father of Vijay and Ravi, who are young boys at this point in time, what is he? He's a labor union leader. And he has been charged with the task of trying to negotiate a new agreement with management. Right? So what you had in 1975 was you had a period of political crisis. You had an economic downturn. The economy was not doing well. Young men were unemployed by the millions, by the tens of millions. Employment was just very difficult. Prospects in life did not look good. And if I may put it in this way, the dream of independence had soured. Right? Because when independence came in 1947, now India is free from 200 years of colonial rule, people had aspirations. And the question is, what had that dream become? Had it dissolved in front of people like Vijay? Right? That's the context you have to think of. Now, there are other contexts too. Those are contexts that if we were doing a film history course, we would certainly look at. What kind of Indian cinema did one have before? Right? How is this film really different? And one of the ways in which it is, of course, different. It's not the first film to do it, but it's one of the major mainstream films to do it, is it puts the big city on the stage. Right? Because the film begins in a small setting, a very small setting, and it will soon gravitate to the big city. And in fact, there's a cinematic device that is used by the filmmaker, which we're going to look at, to see how it moves from the small setting to the larger setting. Right, so here the context now, I'm assuming that all of you have seen the film, but the context here for the first clip that I'm going to show you is, so you've got a labor union leader, he's married, he's got 2 children, the 2 children are the 2 brothers, right, and he has been charged with the task of negotiating a new agreement with the management, and this is where the film actually begins. So let me start with this clip. That's a very typical villain laugh in the Hindi film. There. Okay. And look at this character here, right? The thunder is important. Okay, so He's obviously going to sign. And since I've actually interpreted this scene and some others in my book at great length, I don't need to repeat everything here. But few observations are necessary. On the assumption that some of you haven't read the book and will not read it. Okay? Because I've been a student myself, so I know how things work. All right? So the few observations that are critical here are, number one, that, this is not great cinematic work here that you're seeing. It's not like this is fabulous camera work, nothing of that kind. Right? I mean, although there are cinematic devices I'm going to show you later on, which you really have to know how a film is crafted, how it's edited to use those cinematic devices, and I'll show them to you later on. But the use of thunder is important because, of course, the whole scene is full of exaggeration, right? Enormous exaggeration. So there's an improbable plot, if you ask me. Most Hindi films have an improbable plot. Right? Say improbable plot. Here you know, okay, so this is the effective way that the management can think of working with the labor union leader. Oh, let me just kidnap his kids. Okay? And then, okay, so now you come in and I'm going to show you this photograph. It's frankly a bit of a stretch. But you don't want to use arguments about realism over here. The use of the thunder is important because it's not only, of course, an element of exaggeration here, but the disturbances outside echo the disturbance within you. See, there is a view which is not very popular today. And of course, the whole burden of science has been to try to disprove such views. But this is where the Hindi film, in fact, couldn't care a fig about what science says. What it does is it works on the imagination of the people. It works on what it thinks is a plausible view. And that is that, the view that I'm talking about is that the external world, outside, has some relationship to what goes on within ourselves. So that climate change, for example, is not only about the fact that we have now engaged in massive consumption and therefore, for example, the greenhouse gases have increased enormously and they get trapped, right, in the layer. That's the ozone layer. You can give a purely scientific explanation of what climate change is. But there are some people who will argue in the Indian context that this climate change, okay, this has some relationship to our nature as moral beings, and that we have compromised our nature as moral beings. And climate change, what's happening externally, which somebody would say is a phenomenon that can be described purely in physical terms, this actually has some relationship to the moral turmoil within us. That's one reason why you get the thunder. Okay? And of course, it's a thunderous event. Then another interesting thing, for example, I might have mentioned this in passing, but now you can see it because we've got the clip. So, the pen. I used to get this essay constantly. This was a guaranteed question, by the way, when I was in school. Every school child that I knew who had gone through school in India, we always got this question. Which is mightier, the pen or the sword? Okay, that's what this is. You know, you would get this question that the pen is mightier than the sword. Comment, interpret this question. Do you agree or not? You were all, by the way, supposed to say the pen is mightier than the sword. Because if you say that the sword is mightier than the pen, it meant that you were frankly a person of animal passions. You basically were a Hitler in the making, if I may put it this way. So you were supposed to say, even if you thought that frankly the pen didn't really matter anymore, right? You were supposed to say that the pen is mightier than the sword, right? And this is in a sense, he's saying, sign, here's the pen, right? And of course, you know, somebody might say, well, there's really nothing to interpret. He's just saying sign and give me your assent. But then again, there's this question of writing. When did the whole idea of the signature begin in human history, by the way? There are histories to all of these things. Did we always have a signature? You know, what is a signature? Right? What does it signify? No relationship between signature, signify, sign. All these words have the same etymological root. Okay? A signature is an act of writing. Now, one of the interesting problems in this culture was that, frankly, writing was not the predominant norm through which people, in fact, understood their life and their obligations. And this is what I call the shift from writing introduces a shift in cultures from status to contract. It's a fundamental shift. One of the ways in which you can understand modernity, you can do a whole course just on this. How we shifted from status-based cultures to contract-based cultures. In a status-based culture, people have a certain status, they have a certain value, or lack thereof. It's by ascription. A person has a certain status in a village. That person may not be wealthy, but they may have that status because of their wisdom, their alleged wisdom, for example. In a status-based culture, you cannot enforce agreements through a court of law. If you give an agreement, it's word of mouth. There's a matter of honor. Honor matters a lot in status-based cultures. When you have a contract-based culture, as we do today, for example, in the modern West, and increasingly in India, there's still some pockets that are outside it, frankly, I would argue, but increasingly in India, in a contract-based culture, everything is enforceable in a court of law. By which I mean a metaphor. I mean, I don't mean literally everything, but that is to say that things get codified. And that's when a contract comes into place, an agreement, a written agreement between two individuals or more. And what he wants is a written agreement. Right? And then, of course, the question of the villain. One of the arguments that I have made in some of my other work as well, and again I advance it a little bit in this book, but I've got a whole separate piece on that, and that is that there is frankly no genuine villain in the Hindi film. These characters here, they're like demons. And that's where you get this improbable laugh. Okay? This laugh which you know is completely contrived. And then the Bachchan Singh, that character who's standing there with this ferocious mustache, he's committed 2 murders, he's choked a 7-year-old. Right? Maybe he should spend some time in the police force here in the US. You know, there was a choking case, right? You know that, right? Okay? Right? He's choked a 7-year-old, etc., etc. Right? Now, if you look at this, what we're talking about is that, frankly, it's an exaggeration. When you're an exaggeration in Hindu mythology, you are immediately moved into the realm of the demons. The Rakshas. He's a Rakshas. A person who's watching this film in the Indian subcontinental context will immediately recognize this person as a Rakshas, a demon, not really a villain. And the argument here simply is that, frankly, there's no real villain in the Hindi film. There's no real villain because everyone, even if they happen to be evil, even if they happen to be misguided, miscreants, felons, they all get reabsorbed back into the human community. Right? And that's what's going to happen to Vijay. You know, that yes, he's shot, but he dies in his mother's lap. He dies in his mother's lap. And that's important because it's a sign of the fact that he gets reabsorbed back into the unit from which he was expelled. So ultimately, I want to argue, and of course it's an argument, it's only an argument. All of you here might say, well, we really disagree. I can think of 50 films, someone might say, well, you've got a real villain. And then I'd say, well, let's sit down and watch these films and figure out what is the real villain. Okay? But my summation to you would be that ultimately you don't really have an outsider in the Hindi film. And again, to understand that, you have to go back to the mythos of Indian civilization. Now, I want to just show you a couple more clips. And while I'm looking for those clips, I know where they are, but it might take a bit of time just to find them over here. I'm going to just mention a couple of other things to you. So the clip I want to show you is, okay, so we're going to just begin roughly around here. It's a short 2-3 minute clip. This is a very, very important clip because you know that he's the father, right? So now he's viewed by all the workers as having betrayed the workers, and so therefore he's going to be assaulted by the villagers, so forth and so on, and there are going to be consequences for his son. So let's just look at this for a couple of minutes. They're all shouting. It's on everyone's lip. Anand Babu is a thief. Of course, the Hindi rhymes shor and chor. Shor is noise.
ऐसे कोई बदमाश लड़के थे। देख लेना, कुछ दिनों में लोग सब कुछ भूल जाएंगे। वो तुम्हें माफ कर देंगे। तुम्हारी भी वो मैं दवाइयाँ लेकर आती हूँ।
You can tell from this small setting. Proverbs are widely used, and in Hindi, Urdu, widely used. So he's disappeared. This is the father who's gone now. The cut to the train is important. I mean, one of the ways in which you will write a history of India under colonial rule moving into modernity is the railway journey. Because what did the railways do? It collapsed space. It collapsed space, right? It fundamentally transformed the landscape. And why does he go on a train? That's the anonymity of the city. He's just going to go somewhere where he's not known, where the caste doesn't follow him, history doesn't follow him, nobody knows about the background. Of course, he's evading his responsibilities as a father, as a husband, so forth and so on. Right? But this constant sound of the train at pivotal moments is one of the ways in which you would track what's happening in the plot. Okay? The village drunkard. The drunkard is often encountered, in Babu is an honorific. That's not really his name. Anand is a name, yeah? So here's the second son, the quiet, obedient policeman in the making, right? Notice how the camera is zooming in on the calendar, and then of course it's like a match cut. If you were doing a film, this is what would be called like a match cut, and now it's become Marine Drive, which is one of the major thoroughfares in Bombay. One of the ways in which you recognize a city through photographs is Marine Drive, right? So in this little clip that we've seen, we see the transition from the village or the small town setting to the big city, to the metropolis. And of course, you go to the metropolis for exactly the reason why she mentions that nobody knows us. I want to run away from my history, from my liabilities. You go to the big city, you become anonymous, you create a new life for yourself. Right? And this is, of course, the major story of modernity. One of the principal stories all over the world of modernity. I mean, if you look at China, the enormous transformation that is taking place has a great deal to do with the building up of huge urban areas. And that's what's being echoed here in part. But then one of the things that we were interested in is obviously the tattoo on his arm, because here again you have an act of writing. And that's one of the problems with writing. Writing is ineradicable. Right? Now, I mean, one will have to obviously now, reformulate some of these arguments, because in the light of very recent digital technology, all kinds of things have happened which will make one rethink the status of writing itself. But by and large, the difference between orality and writing is, I think, very transparent to people who have looked at what that shift signified in human history. And in part, this is what is happening in a scene such as this one. Okay? Any questions up till this point in time regarding the clips that we've seen? I want to show a couple more clips, and then I'm going to move to, again, a more general discussion of Hindi cinema. So the next clip that I'm interested in is a clip where this is much further into the film, where Vijay is now already in the pay of the actor here is Iftikhar, so he's the Don, right? This person over here, and he's going to ask him to join his organization, and we want to just see what happens in this particular scene over here. Okay. Right, so the context here is that he's heard about his bravery, because now Vijay is, of course, grown up. He's working as a dock worker in the docks in Bombay. He's got a smuggling organization, and he thinks that Vijay, in fact, might be a very good man. Yes? Yeah, the warehouse fight scene, yeah. Yeah. I can't hear the second half. Can you just speak up a little bit?
The fight scene, is that something supposed to be more realistic?
No. You see, of course, because, taking on 5, 10, 15, 20 people, right? And then, of course, the drama there that he says that, I'm going to take the key out of your pocket and open that lock. I mean, this is an element of exaggeration. So, no, it's not meant to be realistic, and that's one of the things I pointed out in a different context, that very often the hero will take on 50 people and browbeat them into submission, and of course in a way it enhances the status of the hero. This particular fight scene was done actually quite well. So by the way, if you look through the credits of the Hindi film, there's a man called the Fight Master, okay, and that's his whole job, is to orchestrate these fights, to choreograph these fights. But that's, cinematically, one of the more interesting scenes. And of course, it's going to be great entertainment, but it's not really critical to what I would call the arguments that are most compelling about the film. So that's generally how I would look at it. So you've been told about the context. Now just watch the next 75 seconds. That's all. That's what we're interested in here, right? So he's given him an offer to join his organization. So he's in a skyscraper. You'll tell, because he's going to be looking down, and that's what I meant, from the footpath. Now notice, by the way, what happened over here, right? You've got that Marine Drive scene, except that before, and that scene that you saw, which is 40 minutes early in the film, the camera goes and zooms in, and in this case, it's now zooming out. What is it doing? It's not just a cinematic device. It's telescoping the whole notion of memory. What is memory? What is a place of memory in the life of an individual? What is a place of memory in the life of a civilization? Right? One of the big differences between Vijay and Ravi is that Vijay lives on memories. And there'll be all these critical scenes. For example, when Ravi comes to him, he's now become a police officer, and he says, "Bhai, sign karega ya nahi?" Right? Will you sign, brother, or not? Because I've been given this list of criminals, and your name is one of those mentioned on that list. Right? And then what does Vijay say to him? He says, he reminds him, "Bhai, tumhe yaad hai jab hum pavement pe the, bacche the, vagara vagara," right? Etc. When we were young, do you remember? Do you remember that our mother labored, that she was abused? And what is Ravi's response? "Bhai, sign karega ya nahi?" Right? He's not interested in memory. He's not interested in how people actually use their memory, what it means to them. Is it a liability? Is it a hindrance? Is it an asset? And how does one telescope memories? Are the memories of what happened 3 days ago the same as memories of what happened 50 years ago? Right? And what is a relationship between an individual's memory and the memory of a civilization? Right? How is that telescoped? And so this cinematic device here, and you know, I heard everyone, I gave a number of talks based on this when the book came out in Delhi, and everybody told me, oh, you know, the filmmaker couldn't have been thinking about all of those things. You know, that's really academic scholarly explanations, right? And the filmmaker was just thought, hey, this is a nice way to do it. You know, these guys aren't that smart enough. Well, I don't know if they're smart enough or not. And that's frankly irrelevant. And I should also add as a little footnote, and again, you feel free to disagree. Once a work is out in the public domain, whether it's a film or a novel or a poem or a work of history or anything, you cannot say that the creator of that work has the final word on how that work is to be interpreted. Not at all. Once it's out in the public domain, it's out for interpretation, and we have to see what is the most compelling interpretation there. The supposition that the author's intention determines your interpretation is completely bogus. Completely bogus. Of course, there may be, then you'd have to say, is an argument plausible or not? Right? And what are the grounds on which one determines whether an argument is plausible or not? That's what you'd have to really decide upon. Yes? Again, what makes it public?
When a film is released?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's public. Yeah, it's public. I mean, again, you could say that, look, notions of what is public and private have changed a little bit now, because what if it's on the internet and you have a password? Well, you know, we don't need to get into technicalities. What I'm simply saying is that when a book is out, a novel is out, film is out, the supposition that, you know, the person who actually wrote the book or who created the film, that they are the final interpreters of that work, I'm saying that argument cannot be sustained at all. So frankly, I don't care what the filmmaker was actually really thinking when he did this scene, because what I'm suggesting to you is, of course, this scene echoes the earlier scene. And that's another interesting thing if you're a film scholar. If you're a historian, what do? You cite other works. Right? If you're a scholar, you rely upon a body of evidence and you cite other works. Now, that's what films do, by the way. They very often cite other works and they cite themselves. But of course, in order to know that, you have to watch something carefully. And I could show you a film that some of you have seen called Slumdog Millionaire. I'm sure that a few of you have seen it. And I could show you exactly where scenes from 10 different Hindi films have actually been quoted in that film. That's how you would do the work of interpretation. But here it's very clear, because it's the same scene effectively, except that the cinematic device is now the reverse. That there on the calendar, there's a calendar on the wall, the camera zooms in on the calendar now becomes the scene. It becomes the street. That's the match cut. Here, you've got Marine Drive, and the camera is now not zooming in, it's zooming out. And of course, it's also the difference of the perspective between the footpath and the skyscraper. And of course, what is the story of Vijay? It's the story of someone who went from the footpath to the skyscraper. Right? So we just continue with this for 10 more seconds. So there, that's the end of the zooming out. Yeah? And there's this scene now. We're going to see the end of that. So here's a memory, by the way. Right? So he's going to now toss the money. And this is the famous line. Another memory will come in now. Everybody knows this line in India. If you say this line, everybody knows it. And one of the things that's happened, of course, with the Hindi film is these dialogues have become completely autonomous from the film. You know, some people might not even recognize the film any longer. So when this film Sholay came out, it has all these fabulous dialogues, okay? And the dialogues were put on a tape and circulated, and people never bothered to watch the film, some of them, and they just knew the dialogues. Right? So interesting phenomena here. And this is one reason why, if you have a film scholar who says, well, I'm just going to study Indian cinema exactly the same way I study Hollywood, well, frankly, you're not going to get anywhere at all. Because the conventions, the protocols, the norms, the whole cultural context that shapes how these films circulate in this domain is vastly different. Right? Vastly different. And again, we're not speaking about, this is not exactly, you know, the most sophisticated camera work that you can think about. Right? Although the film, of course, goes back to the 1970s, so you have to take into account, you know, various technical changes that have taken place over the course of the last 4 decades almost, right? But I think that, you know, with these few observations that I made, what I've tried to suggest to you is that, look, I mean, you know, that this film is a very good way of understanding. I wish I could show a few more clips, but I don't think we have the luxury of being able to do that. That this film enables you to understand quite a bit about what's happening, in India in the 1960s, 70s, moving into the 1980s, the whole culture of the city, the problem of the angry young man, the transition from the village to the city, what happens when cultural norms get drastically changed, when writing, for example, becomes much more common, when things move from status to contract, right? So forth and so on. That's the reason why this film is hugely emblematic of what was happening and why it's an iconic film, what was happening in the 1960s, 70s, and the period thereafter. Now, let me make a few more general observations about Hindi cinema. And then what I want to end up with is not Hindi cinema, but I want to look very briefly at the notion of street culture in India, because I want to have a slightly more expansive understanding of what we mean when we speak about popular culture. One of the most interesting things that you find, this film reflects this change. The films that were made in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the language was largely Urdu. Now this is going to begin to change in the 70s. Okay? And you remember my discussion of Urdu, Hindi, Hindustani, that Urdu and Hindi in fact are very similar, and what we speak in North India, for example, is what is really called Hindustani, but when you and it's widely understood in Pakistan, in most parts of Pakistan, right? But that when you want to Arabicize the language more, then you can speak of it as Urdu, and it becomes less comprehensible to a speaker like myself. And when you want to Sanskritize it a bit more, that is that you make it into more Hindi, right? Now, what was happening in the Hindi film? And this had to do with the fact that partition took place, because many of the people who were involved in the Hindi film industry were actually people who were fluent in Urdu. Right? Many of the major script writers were, in fact, Urdu speakers and Urdu writers. And many of the words, particularly words, by the way, that have to do with such things as romance, mohabbat. Mohabbat is not a Sanskrit word. It's more a Urdu word, because its reference point is Persian and Arabic. Ishq, okay, another word. The Hindi word would be pyar, right? But ishq, mohabbat. Now, one of the things that you will notice if you watch the Hindi film attentively, how mohabbat and ishq, their use started to diminish beginning in the 70s, right? Because what's happening here? The communalization, that's what's happening here, right? We've studied communalism in a political context. Now we're looking at some of its other ramifications. It's the communalization of the Hindi film. The reluctance on the part of script writers to say, hey, we're going to use Urdu words. You know, there's a Hindi film critic, and he said, I'm going to drop my list of 20 films that I think are all-time interesting films. And if you look at the list of these films, Qayamat se Qayamat tak, right? I mean, here again, you're getting Urdu words, right? Farz, right? Obligation, Kya farz hai tumhara? What is your obligation? Right? These are all Urdu words. And many of these films, in fact, had these Urdu words. Let me give you a different context so you understand, because one of the things we have not spoken about, and this gives me an occasion to speak about it a little bit. We've spoken about it in one context when I described the Hindi-Urdu thing. I'm going to just flesh it out a bit more. And what I'm talking about here is language politics. What is the politics of language? What kind of language is used in these films? Now, so my father, for example, so he's a partition refugee. He came in 1947 because he was born in that part of India which went over to Pakistan. Okay? He comes from a place called Multan. In fact, the language there was actually a language that is called Multani or Seraiki. That's the language. Right? He came from that part of what became Pakistan and then came over to India in 1947. Now, like many others, even though he came from a Hindu family, he actually did not know Hindi. That is, he did not know the Devanagari script, the script in which you write Hindi, because that was not the script that was common in that part of undivided India. But like many others who came over to India post-1947, he had to learn Hindi, the Devanagari script. And most interestingly, when the 1951 census was carried out in India, all these refugees who had come, very few of whom actually knew the Devanagari script. They were not, in other words, Hindi speakers as such. They were more Urdu speakers. When they were asked to declare what their mother tongue is, guess what they did? They all declared Hindi. The vast majority of them. Which was, of course, completely inaccurate. But why did they do so? Because the idea was, now you've come to India, it's a predominantly Hindu country now, so this is Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. They all go together. Hindustan is the name for India, right? The land of the Hindus. So people like my father very often would give their first language now as Hindi rather than Urdu, even when many of them did not in fact actually know the Hindi script, because they had now become communalized. They had started thinking in religious categories, right? So that Hindi becomes the language of Hindus, Urdu becomes the language of Muslims, right? That's the communalization. And one of the interesting things that's happening in the Hindi film, if you see this film, you see relatively few Urdu words, relatively few, in comparison to films made in the 1960s. And then when you move into the 1980s and 90s, the use of Urdu will diminish even further. It will diminish even further. Okay? So the word pyar, and I cannot tell you how many Hindi films have been made, many of them unwatchable, by the way. Don't, when you see the word pyar in the films, probably dump it, usually. Pyar means love. Maine pyar kiya, mujhe tese pyar hai, I've loved you, I love you, this and that. I mean, really tedious, frankly, most of them. Okay? But pyar. Films were not made with that kind of title in the 50s. You would have ishq, you would have mohabbat, something like that. I'm simplifying it, obviously, because we'd have to look at a number of samples here and say, can we now document these changes that I'm really talking about? And of course, my submission to you is that they can be easily documented. There's no difficulty in doing that whatsoever. All right, so one other consideration I raised for you is the question of language politics. Secondly, a lot of these films, all the way till the 80s, had a token Muslim very often. There was a special class of films, by the way, they're called the Muslim social. We won't get into that altogether. It's called the Muslim social. So these are films which are about Muslim families, or the Muslim ethic, or what happens in Muslim communities or in a Muslim family. And there's a small but distinguished number of films which form part of what is called the Muslim social. I'm looking at mainstream Hindi cinema. In mainstream Hindi cinema, there wasn't much room for the Muslim. But very often, you had what was called the good Muslim. So there would be one token figure. So contrary to what many people think, who would have thought that, the Muslim was always a villain. No, no, no. In fact, the Hindi filmmakers went all of the way out, as it were. Way out to do what? To try to represent the Muslim as a part of the fabric of Indian life. But of course, this was ambivalent, because you give him or her a minor role, usually him. And what would be the good Muslim? The good Muslim, very simple example. Okay, so you take a film, for example, such as Mirch Masala. Right? Mirch Masala is a film made by Ketan Mehta. And in this, the good Muslim is this man who's in his 60s. He's got a flowing beard. That's one way in which you recognize the Muslim. And he looks upon all women as his daughters. That is, that you honor them, you protect them, so forth and so on. Right? The good Muslim never has any lust for a woman. Never. Right? So it's a different kind of exaggeration, a different kind of stereotype. One of the things that happens in the Hindi film, beginning in the late 1980s, the good Muslim begins to disappear. And one of the reasons why the good Muslim begins to disappear is because the Hindi film is to some extent a barometer. Okay, so there was this question about realism, is a scene realistic or not? A particular scene may or may not be realistic. For example, that scene in the warehouse. But the Hindi film taken as a whole is a barometer of what is happening. It gives you some sense of what is happening in that culture, in that society. And one of the reasons why the good Muslim begins to disappear, beginning in the late 1980s, is because, obviously, Muslim geopolitics starts to become of critical importance. The fight in Afghanistan, the jihad in Kashmir, right? The secessionist movement in Kashmir, the whole rise of the so-called Muslim terrorist, the Muslim terrorist figure who didn't exist in the Hindi film in the 50s, 60s, just didn't exist at all. And now, by the 1990s, there were dozens of films with the Muslim terrorist, right? So on the one hand, you cannot be making, obviously, all of these films about the Muslim terrorist, and then on the other hand, have the good Muslim. And that's what I mean when I say that the Hindi film is a barometer of what is happening in that society, how politics have shifted. And finally, just to give you a couple more illustrations of some of the changes that have taken place, films made in the 40s, 50s, 60s, here again, Deewaar is a transition point. But films made 40s to early 70s, they were largely set in the Indian village. Beginning in the late 1970s, the city becomes dominant. By the mid-1990s. The village has disappeared from the Hindi film, which is astonishing because, of course, India is still made up of rural India to a substantial degree, right? Not that everybody is a peasant or a farmer, obviously, but rural India still accounts for the bulk of the population of India. The figures are now slowly changing, right? So for the first time in the last census, more people were added in urban India than in rural India for the first time, according to the census of 2011. But we're talking here about 1975 here, and we're talking about what happened in this late 70s, 80s, 90s, the first decade of the new millennium. And what happened was the village had completely disappeared. And when it disappears, one of the things it means, frankly, is that people have banished the village from their mind. They look at it as some place that's backward, medieval, a place that you want to forget. But of course, when you do that, it also means that you have banished all the people who live there from your mind as well, from your sensibility. Right? So dramatic shift. And what came in place of the village? Not just the city, something else came. For those of you who know the Hindi film, if I mention it, it will immediately ring a bell, I'm sure. What came in its place was the diaspora. Beginning in the mid-1990s, a lot of Hindi films begin to be set in the diaspora. So the classic illustration, I'm going to give you the acronym. All these long Hindi films have acronyms. It's called DDLJ. Just type in DDLJ in Google and you'll see what happens, right? Okay? Dil Wale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge. Right? 1995 film. Crucial. Why? Because the first half of the film is what? The first half of the film is now set in the diaspora. And then the second half of the film, interestingly enough, goes back to India and goes to the village. Which, of course, only an NRI can go back to the village. Right? Nobody in India wants to be in the village. They all want to go out. But here, the village is the space that you imagine when you're sitting here. As an Indian who's been living in the diaspora, and in fact, DDLJ shows that. He says, I can smell, I can imagine the smell of the mustard fields of Punjab. The earthiness of the soil there, right? It's the imagining of what the village was like. And so in DDLJ, the first half of the film is set actually not in the US, it's set in Britain, in fact. A lot of the diaspora films were mainly the US. Good example, Pardes or Jeans. Both of them very, very mediocre films, but worth watching simply to understand what's happening in the Hindi film. Why has it gravitated towards the diaspora? It's gravitated towards the diaspora because all your urban middle class Indians, their great desire in life is to all come to the US. And if you can't go to the US, then you go to Britain. If you can't go to Britain, then you settle for a place called Canada. And if you can't go to Canada, then you settle for Australia. You know, that's the pecking order, basically, right? Okay, and then if not Australia, then New Zealand. There are 5 English-speaking countries, right? So, this is the pecking order. The top choice, the US. The American dream, live it out, right? They all want to do that. So what's happening here now? What's happening? And that's the reason why this Hindi film is now shifting to the diaspora. Because it's only speaking to the urban people, you see. It's only speaking to the urban people. And this was going to be the dramatic shift. And we're not even looking at economic considerations such as the market in the diaspora, so forth and so on. Those are obviously important considerations because the Indian population in the US starts to grow phenomenally, right? Phenomenally between 1965 and obviously the present. Now you're talking about a little over 3 million. In 1965, I don't know how many of you know how many Indians there were in the United States. In fact, Indians were not even permitted in the United States. Right? If for those of you in Asian American studies, you should know about the alien laws, right? The exclusion of Asians from the United States, all Asians for a period of time, and then 1965, we're talking about 4,000 or 5,000 Indians in all in the United States. So there are these shifts. The Hindi film is going to not simply reflect these shifts. In some ways, it's actually going to shape them, right? So that's the relationship that we have to understand between the Hindi film and Indian society as a whole. And last comment, that is that we have to understand that yes, there's this thing called Hollywood, but Bollywood has had a pretty worldwide following. There are many countries in the world where actually Bollywood films are much more popular than Hollywood films. And there used to be a song, you can find it on YouTube in a second, Mera Juta Hai Japani. Okay, this is a song from a film called Shri 420. Shri is Mr. 420. 420 is, by the way, the section of the Indian Penal Code which refers to people who engage in illegal activities such as robbery and so forth and so on. Okay, so this film is called Shri 420, Mr. 420, and there's this song, and the film begins with this song, right? And the song basically will, my shoes are Japanese, my pants are from Britain, my cap, my red cap is Russian, but my heart is Indian, right? And this song, I cannot tell you how popular it was. I mean, I've gone to the remotest parts of the world, and I always meet somebody in his 50s, and he'll start reciting the song to me. I mean, you go to places like Moldavia. Moldavia, you haven't heard of it, right? Moldavia, Ukraine, okay, Croatia. Not to mention, of course, places like Dubai and Saudi Arabia, so forth and so on. In the Middle East, Hindi films were and remain exceedingly popular. One argument, of course, was that, well, there are restraints. You're not going to show women in parading around in the nude. There's some degree of modesty and decorum, and therefore these societies say, well, this is more appropriate for our societies. We're not going to get into all of that discussion. But I'm just saying that these are some of the reasons that have been advanced for why Hindi films are immensely popular. All over East Africa, West Africa, the Caribbean, immensely popular. So it had a worldwide following. Iran, I was in Iran some years ago, and I was astonished to find how many people knew Hindi films, right? But again, only a few iconic films remained with them, and these were films that went back to the 1950s, 60s, and so on. Okay, any questions about this? I get time for one question. Yeah.
The portrayal of religion. So there's a lot of scenes in Hindi films where you have the actor or actress or mother praying to the Hindu god.
Yeah.
But I can't recall a single scene in popular films.
With namaz.
Yes.
Yeah, well, yeah, now you will find it in some of the Muslim socials. You will find it in some of the Muslim socials, which, as I said, is a special category of a film, okay, which is usually shaped around the lives of a Muslim community. There's very often a narrative of Muslim feudal life and the decay of the feudal landlord, for example. That would be an illustration of Pakiza, very famous film, for example, with Meena Kumari. All right. By the way, many of these actors and actresses from that generation who were Muslims took on Hindu names. They took on Hindu names. Right? And one of the reasons they took on Hindu names was because the idea was that, well, A, you're going to have greater visibility in India. It's B, problems from within your own community. A Muslim woman acting in a film, there could be trouble within the community for the Muslim woman. So very often these women would actually take on Hindu names. They would take on a different persona. That's what we're saying. But the answer to your question is, you're absolutely right, that it's not to be found. Namaz is, Muslim prayers, right? Which are done at specified times of the day. So this namaz, doing it in a mosque, it's not going to be found in a large number of films, but there will be films. I mean, a very good illustration where you find a namaz scene is Veer Zara. Okay? Veer Zara is a film that came out about 10, 12 years ago. And that's actually, I'm glad you asked that question because it reminds me of something else which is quite important. And that is that if you look at the South Asian context now, not just India, so Indian films, Hindi mainstream films, are immensely popular in Pakistan as well, immensely popular. And what is really surprising to many people is that some of the films that were immensely popular, a good example, I mean the film is really bad, this particular film I'm going to mention right now, and it's really long. So you have to have enormous levels of tolerance to sit through this kind of film. It's called Border. Okay, as in border between India and Pakistan. So this film goes back to 1998 and it's about the border between India and Pakistan. But the border is just a metaphor for the border between the Hindu and the Muslim, between yourself and the other, right? Now, what is extraordinarily interesting is that this film was a jingoistic film, immensely patriotic. It didn't bother with the good Muslim. There are no good Muslims, okay? There are no good Muslims. It didn't even bother with this pretense of having a good Muslim. But guess what? The film's songs were immensely popular in Pakistan. Immensely popular. Why is that the case? How does one interpret it? And the reason for that is because the audiences, in fact, are always tapping into things that are subliminal. They're tapping into Indian mythos. In other words, the audience that is watching the film, they understand that, look, this border, this is a contrivance. This is an artifact of history. There was never any border between us as a people. Right? So that same jingoism you simply transplanted. You just imagine that it's a Muslim singing the song saying, "Long live Pakistan," instead of saying, "Long live Hindustan." That's what the audience does in their mind. They transpose these things. They don't have the difficulty that sophisticated scholars, who are liberals and secular scholars always have and they'll condemn the film and say it's complete rubbish. This is a jingoistic film. How can anybody tolerate it? How do we as a people tolerate it? Well, the interesting thing is, why were people in Pakistan so hooked onto it? We've got to try to figure that out. Veer Zara, another interesting film. Not really jingoistic. Okay? But nonetheless, it shows Pakistanis partly in a good light, partly in a bad light. Okay? And the film was immensely popular. It's, by the way, also a great cinematic work. The music is just superb, right? So you might want to see that film, Veer Zara. I'll write it down here. But there you do find a scene that we're talking about, which shows namaz, okay, Muslim prayers. Veer Zara. Okay, and this is about 10, 12 years old, approximately 10, 12 years old. All right, let me say a few words, 5 minutes or so, about popular culture as a whole, because obviously Hindi films made in Malayalam, which we haven't looked at, regional cinemas, this obviously occupies a huge place in the history of India, and it occupies a huge place in our fantasies. Cinema is partly about fantasy, right? But that does not exhaust, cannot exhaust, and should not exhaust our understanding of popular culture. And one of the things that I had assigned to you is a very short piece called Street Culture, which is really an extraordinary topic. And the first thing I want to submit to you is that you cannot really understand street culture if you're looking at the United States. For example, Los Angeles does not have street culture. I'm sorry. If somebody thinks that 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica is street culture, all right, well, they don't know what street culture is. But that's not an answer. That's not obviously an argument, because somebody could say, well, why isn't it? Right? And then, of course, we could say, well, that has to do with urban redevelopment. You know, that a street culture is where things develop organically. It's not like you plan to go out from where I live in Encino, let me take my kids to 3rd Street Promenade, because they shouldn't have lived in LA for 18 years and then have said to somebody that, hey, we never went to the 3rd Street Promenade, right, which is supposed to represent street culture. Right? Street culture is a mode of life. It's a mode of living. It's not just a street that you mark and say, pedestrians only, no cars on this little stretch for 3 blocks, right? Which is what 3rd Street Promenade is. Urban redevelopment, right? Bring in all the yuppies, you know, put in a few Starbucks and Chipotle or whatever and some higher end, you know, stores, and that becomes street culture. No, it isn't. Right? Street culture, as I said, is a mode of life. It dissolves, number one, the distinction between public and private, especially in India. And that is why the piece by Arjun Apodra, a very simple piece in some ways, but extremely sophisticated, because he's able to pinpoint some of the things that are happening on the street in India, right? So you go to walk down a street, and it's not just that you're going to find street food. Of course, one of the things that makes for street culture is street food, and a variety of street food, right? But one of the things you'll find is, all right, somebody there, he's willing to cut your hair in front of everybody. He's willing to clean your ears, poke something into ears and take out the wax, right? There are people who are actually taking a bath on the street, because you may have one of these, you know, it's I forget the word for it. It's a kind of a tap, and you have to you know, push it, the lever. You have to push the lever, and then water comes down. It might be the only tap for, let's say, 3 blocks of that street, and people will come to collect the water, and they'll take a bath, right? And you can see that happening right in front of you, right? And what is happening there? It's not that these people are shameless. You know, somebody might think, oh, well, there's no sense of shame. No, quite to the contrary. The fact that they have shame is one reason why they'll always leave their underwear on while they're taking a bath. What's happening here is the fact that our notions of public and private, which are an artifact of 18th century history. When did the notion of the public and the private first begin to emerge in Western civilization? When did we say there were certain things that were public and certain things that were strictly private? It's an 18th century distinction. It comes about with the rise of the subject and what we call subjectivity, right? Just as pets start to become dominant in Europe only in the 18th century. And in the Indian street, what does it do? It dissolves this distinction. They're animals on the road, but they're not pets, right? So just go into Google, just type in street scenes Old Delhi, street scenes Agra, just see 3 videos of 1 minute each, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about, right? There are people who are doing all these activities, there are animals on the road, and what we're saying is that what street culture does is it dissolves the distinction between the public and the private. It's a mode of life, it's a mode of living. It's a different kind of space that we have to think about. Now, I haven't been able to flesh this out, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea. And one last comment I want to say about that, because in my next lecture, what we'll do is we'll be looking, obviously, at the readings for this week. And I want to really take us to the era of globalization. I want to look at what we mean when we speak about India in the modern world. What is the relationship between India and the modern world and the whole fabric of globalization? What about India's aspiration to be a great power? Right? What about the fact that India is a nuclear state? Right? What are the anxieties that we have as a people today? Right? And how do we understand some of these anxieties? Those are the kinds of questions I'm interested in, and that's what that lecture will do. And it's intended as one lecture. I know it's mentioned as 2 lectures, but That's what I meant when I said the syllabus was crafted in such a way that we would have just enough time to cover exactly what is mentioned on the syllabus. But my last comment for today, as far as street culture and all of that goes, and I just mention it again for you to reflect upon it. Many people here in the West will assume, given the rates of poverty in India, the fact that poverty is endemic, that there are hundreds of millions of people living in poverty. Many people will assume that India has a great many homeless people. Now, I want to suggest to you that this is an excellent illustration, whether you accept the argument or not, but the idea is for you to think about it. It's an excellent illustration of the problems of using the categories that have developed in the context of Western history and then applying them automatically, unthinkingly to India. India does not really have homeless people. It has people who do not have a roof on their head. It has people who do not have enough clothes on their back. It has people who are malnutritioned. It does not have homeless people. What I mean by that is the fact that unlike in the West, unlike in LA, when I take a bus and I walk back to my home and I pass by an overhead where there's a freeway, I see 2 or 3 homeless people. They've got a cart sometimes, or 3, 4 bags, and all their life's belongings are there, and they've been dumped. They do not form part of any community. In India, even the homeless form part of a community. That is why we do not really have homeless people. We have people who do not have houses. That's different. They do not have a shelter on their roof. But when they sleep on the pavement, they'll sleep on the pavement with 10 other people. And those 10 people together form part of a community for them, which is important. The homeless in America are usually without a community of any kind. The category of the homeless is an invention of modern industrial civilization. And we should be extremely wary of trying to simply use the categories and assume that the 300 million plus people in India who do not have a roof over their head, that they are, quote, homeless. Okay, and that's one of the things that street culture does. It facilitates the acceptance of people who may not have a roof on their head, may not have clothes on their back, and all of that, but nonetheless are still part of a community. All right, we're going to stop with that.